Here we go.
I have put this off for so very, very long. But thanks to my, in hindsight, possibly misguided idea of reviewing all the Razzie Worst Picture winners in chronological order, I can put it off no longer. It's time to talk about Gigli. What I said at the end of the last episode of Cinematic Excrement was true. I've only seen bits and pieces of this movie, never actually watched it all the way through. Never wanted to.
And why would I? Almost everyone who saw this movie, critics and moviegoers alike, said it was one of the worst movies ever made. Oddly enough, I don't remember hearing much in the way of specific details. I just remember hearing that it was really, really bad. And even among the few reviews on Rotten Tomatoes that are considered positive, about half of them boil down to, there were worse movies that year. Not exactly glowing praise.
So yeah, I stayed as far away from Gigli as possible. It was the summer of 2003, I had just graduated college and was in the midst of what would prove to be a lengthy job hunt, and I didn't have the disposable income to waste on good movies, let alone bad ones. I had no reason to seek it out. But now, almost 18 years later, it's finally time to sit down and watch this 2-hour travesty.
And after all this time, I'm thinking it can't possibly live up to the hype. I mean, I still expect it to be bad, but can it really be that bad? Well, either I'm gonna be disgusted or disappointed. Either way, fun times ahead! Oh boy.
Ben Affleck, fresh off his box office disappointment Daredevil, plays a low-level gangster in Los Angeles named Larry Gigli. The first time we see him, he's threatening to give some guy who owes his boss money a ride in the dryer. And somehow there is no one else in this laundromat in the middle of the damn day in Los Angeles.
Shockingly, not the most unbelievable thing that happens in the movie.
Early on in the film, 2 people mispronounce his name as either Gigli or Gigli. You might think this would lead to a running gag with people constantly mispronouncing his name. It doesn't. It never happens again.
Must I do everything myself? Fine. So,
Mr. Jiggly's boss, Louis, played by Lenny Veneto, has a friend in legal trouble, and Louis thinks the best way to help his friend is by going after the guy that's bringing the hammer down on him. They can't hurt the guy directly because he's in New York, but he just so happens to have a mentally challenged brother, Brian, played by Justin Bartha, living in a group home in LA. How goddamn convenient. So the plan is for Mr. Gigli to kidnap the brother from the group home, which apparently has no security whatsoever, and use him as leverage over the guy in New York. As you can imagine, this does not go smoothly. Brian proves to be tough for Mr. Luigi to handle, and tough for the audience to tolerate. He has the mind of a child and can't communicate well, and he seems to be in a constant state of horniness. He has a thing for calling some Australian weather service and racking up huge phone bills because he likes the weather girl's voice, and he's obsessed with going to the beach, or what he calls the Baywatch, because of all the beautiful, scantily clad girls.
I think that's where the sex is. I think so. I think that's where the sex is.
oh no, it's not. Not unless you want sand to end up in places where sand should not be.
By the way, what is up with the somber music playing during what is clearly supposed to be a comedic moment? This happens a few times during the movie. It's like someone put the soundtrack on random. Even more baffling is how Larry handles Brian's constant request to go to the Baywatch. He pretends to get a call on his walkie-talkie and claims someone on the other end is telling him the Baywatch is closed for the day. The thing is, he has a cell phone. Why doesn't he just pretend he's getting the call on his cell phone instead of a friggin' flashlight?
I'm starting to wonder if Brian is really the mentally challenged one here.
Oh, one more thing about Brian. He has Tourette syndrome. Or rather, what Hollywood thinks is Tourette syndrome. 3 guesses what that means.
Your dog used to be dog at piss fart.
That is one of the few clips of Brian I can show you without scaring away the advertisers. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Tourette syndrome involves certain uncontrollable actions, or tics. Sometimes these tics are physical, sometimes they are vocal. And yes, one such possible tic is randomly blurting out obscenities. But it's only one of many possible tics, and most people with Tourette syndrome do not do this. But every time we see Tourette syndrome in Hollywood, it's always the same goddamn thing. Hey, nice weather we're having. Shit, dick ass! It gets old.
Well, shortly after Mr. Gigli brings Brian back to his apartment, he's visited by a woman, played by Jennifer Lopez, who identifies herself as Ricki, although her real name is Rochelle.
Now, you might be wondering why she's using a fake name. Anyway,
Ricki's introduction makes very little sense, much like the rest of the movie. She begins by claiming she just moved into the building and needs to make an urgent phone call, but her phone isn't hooked up yet, so she asks if she can use Mr. Giggly's phone.
It's probably a local call.
it's probably a local call? What a strange thing to say.
For some reason, he gives this obvious bullshit a pass and allows her to use his phone for probably a local call. And after a sequence that seemingly takes forever, she suddenly informs Mr. Squeegee that the obvious bullshit she just told him was obvious bullshit, and she was actually hired by Lewis to help him look after Brian. And a probably local call to Lewis confirms she is actually telling the truth.
I have so many questions. Why would Lewis not tell him about Ricki ahead of time? Why did she need to make up that story about moving into the building and needing to use his phone? And how can there be so much stupid in this movie when we're not even 20 minutes in?
By now, you're probably expecting me to reveal to you that this movie was made by some incompetent director who wouldn't know a gaffer from a gopher. But that's actually not the case. This was directed by Martin Brest, who also directed Beverly Hills Cop, Midnight Run, and Scent of a Woman, all critically acclaimed films. So what happened here? Well, supposedly, the version of Gigli we got is not what Brest had in mind. His initial plan was to make more of a straight-up mob movie, and he initially made a darker and more violent 2-hour and 40-minute cut. The fact that the trailer has a significant amount of footage that is not in the theatrical cut would give credence to this theory. But according to an interview with Ben Affleck, the studio wrestled creative control away from him and changed it into a romantic comedy, largely because of the tabloids' obsession with Affleck and Lopez, who met on the set of Gigli and started dating shortly thereafter. I am honestly curious about how that 2-hour 40-minute cut turned out, but so far it has never seen the light of day and probably never will.
Then again, we did eventually get the theatrical cut of Color of Night on home video. It took 25 years, but we got it. Maybe someday we'll get that long-lost director's cut of Gigli. But please do not start a hashtag for that. No. We do not need to turn this into another Release the Snyder Cut. Thank you very much.
There's another thing I noticed while rewatching the trailer for this movie. There's a pretty significant plot point that is not mentioned at all, and this must have shocked the hell out of the 3 or 4 people who saw this movie in theaters. The trailer would suggest Ricki was not at all into Mr. Wheelie at first, but over time she grew to like him and they became romantically involved. This is indeed how the movie plays out, but there's a twist. There's a very specific thing about him that turns Ricki off.
Your penis.
Oh, she saw Gone Girl.
What does that mean?
It means I'm gay.
Yep, that's the premise for this romantic comedy. Mr. Jiminy falls in love with a lesbian. Wait a minute. Didn't Ben Affleck already do that once before?
This is pretty much the plot of Kevin Smith's Chasing Amy. I mean, Chasing Amy had comic book artists instead of gangsters, but it did have Ben Affleck playing an admitted Kevin Smith self-insert character who falls in love with a lesbian, played by Joey Lauren Adams. At first, he is content for their relationship to simply be platonic, or at least he tells himself he is, but eventually his feelings boil over and he professes his love for her. And somehow, this actually works, and the lesbian falls in love with a dude. Until said dude f***s everything up because he's an insecure moron.
Whether Chasing Amy has aged well largely depends on who you ask. There are many differing opinions, even within the lesbian community. On the one hand, it does seem kinda shitty to suggest a lesbian can be converted to heterosexuality by simply meeting the right guy. John Oliver talked about this once.
Set aside the notion that any lesbian can be magically turned straight if the right guy comes along. What's extra offensive in hindsight is the idea that that guy would be Ben Affleck.
I know, right? Especially with that goatee, it's like noticeably thinner on one side. This supports my theory that there are basically 3 types of men in the world. Those who can grow a proper goatee, those who can't, and those who can't but think they can. But I digress.
As I was saying, the lesbian's conversion to heterosexuality does seem kinda shitty on the surface. However, there's another school of thought that says this is actually an accurate representation of sexual fluidity, and while Chasing Amy never actually uses the word bisexual, it serves its characters well by not forcing them into a box where you're either straight or gay and there is no in-between.
Now, as a cishet white dude, I'm pretty sure I am not the right person to tell you which side of that argument is correct, but I will say this much. I do believe the concept of sexual fluidity is perfectly valid, and it absolutely should be examined in popular culture. But I also think examining a topic like that takes a certain level of maturity. And I don't think that level of maturity had been reached in 1997 by the guy who directed Mallrats.
That said, regardless of how mature or immature Kevin Smith may be, when it comes to discussions of sexuality, Chasing Amy is miles ahead of Gigli. Chasing Amy was basically Kevin Smith attempting to teach himself how non-heteronormative society works, with all the good and bad that comes with such an experiment. Gigli, I don't know what in the hell they were trying to do with Gigli. And because there was a lot of reported studio interference, I can't say for sure if Brest deserves most of the blame for this. But someone involved with the making of this movie definitely had some issues with women or homosexuals or perhaps anyone who is different. After Mr. Jinkies tries and fails to get in Ricki's pants, not only does he continue to try, he goes on this long-winded rant about how lesbians have the wrong idea because men are anatomically designed for women's sexual pleasure.
This leads to an argument about which sex has the better sex organ, and I assure you, it's every bit as stupid as it sounds. And it doesn't end there.
There are further stupid arguments involving masculinity and femininity, like when Ricki asks Larry to check his fingernails, and she suggests checking your nails one way means you're straight, and the other way means you're gay.
Hey, I remember having an argument just like that one. When I was 13, these are grown-ass adults. What's their excuse?
Anyway, when all this bullshit inevitably doesn't convince Ricki that she should give up the pussy and switch to an all-dick diet, Mr. Juggalo goes on this rant about how his life sucks because there's this beautiful woman and she's amazing and talented and gorgeous, but she doesn't like him because she's gay and he has a penis and it's not fair. It's just not fair.
I don't think that was actually how he sounded in the movie. It was probably just in my head.
And remarkably, this actually works. No, for real, after all that whining, she finally decides to sleep with him. Because nothing turns a woman on more than a guy complaining about the friend zone.
It's turkey time.
Huh?
Gobble, gobble.
You know, that right there is one of the most beautiful, sexiest women walking God's green earth. And if I was in Mr. Jamby's position, and she said to me, "It's turkey time, gobble, gobble," I would totally kick her out of bed, would not hesitate to do so. That is, without a doubt, the dumbest line ever uttered during a love scene in cinematic history. And yes, that includes the entire 50 Shades trilogy. I don't think I'll ever be able to have an erection again. Thanks, J-Lo.
And we should probably talk about J-Lo. Her acting career has been the subject of ridicule over the years, and not without cause. However, she did ultimately turn into a pretty good actress, as anyone who has seen Hustlers will attest. But in 2003, she wasn't there yet. Her performance in Gigli is not good. There's a scene where Ricki, Brian, and Mr. Jigglypuff are at a fast food restaurant with some arrogant high schoolers who insist on blasting Urban Dance Squad for everyone in a 5-block radius to hear.
High schoolers haven't changed much in the last 20 years, have they?
Larry tries and fails to intimidate them, so Ricki takes a shot by describing some ancient martial arts technique that involves gouging out someone's eyeball and, in the process, destroying their visual memory. And boy, howdy, am I not buying this. Not just because it sounds like total bullshit, but also because J-Lo neither looks nor sounds the least bit intimidating in this scene. And somehow, after she's done scaring these kids into turning down the music, this happens.
I want you guys to study hard and keep your grades up, all right? Okay, everyone, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I'm sorry, when did this turn into an after-school special? And we're back.
So yeah, J-Lo's performance in this movie is really, really bad. But I don't place all of the blame on her. The dialogue she was given to work with is atrocious, and I don't think any actress could have made it sound convincing. J-Lo was actually not the studio's first choice, by the way. They originally signed Halle Berry to play Ricki, but she had to drop out due to a scheduling conflict with X2. dodged a bullet there. But even if she had stuck around, I don't think she could have done any better. Meryl freaking Streep could not have given a good performance with this script. Getting back to the story, such as it is, while Ricki and Mr. Jellybean have custody of Brian, they are visited by several strange characters. First, there's Christopher Walken, playing Detective... well, let's be honest, Detective Christopher Walken. And at this point, I don't think it's a secret that Walken has trouble memorizing his lines. He's been very open about this. But my God, it is so obvious when he's reading off of cue cards in this scene.
It's something that I may not have noticed if I didn't know ahead of time that Walken had trouble with memorization, but once I see it, I can't unsee it.
The purpose of this cameo is to provide exposition where we learn Brian's brother, the guy bringing the hammer down on Lewis's friend, is a federal prosecutor, or as Walken refers to him, a very federal prosecutor. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but oddly enough, it's not the weirdest thing Walken says during this conversation. After pointlessly interrogating Mr. Quan Chi about Brian's disappearance, he goes off on this tangent about getting some pie from Marie Callender's. If I didn't know better, I'd swear he went off script here.
Put some on your head. Your tongue would slap your brains out trying to get to it.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
Then there's the scene where Ricki's former lover shows up out of nowhere and tries to kill herself. And they take her to the hospital, and we never see her again. Big-lipped something something.
She's gonna be okay.
Oh, well that's good to know. Who is she and why is she in this movie?
And at this point, Lewis informs our dipshit duo that kidnapping the very federal prosecutor's brother has, shockingly, not convinced him to back off. So he suggests cutting off the kid's thumb and mailing it to him to send a message. This is a step too far, even for our pair of wannabe gangsters, but they want to placate their boss. So they sneak into a hospital morgue, which apparently has even worse security than Brian's group home, and cut a thumb off a random corpse and mail it to the very federal prosecutor.
And this brings us to our final cameo performance in this movie, and it's a doozy.
Lewis's friend comes to town and finally gets to meet Ricki and Mr. Gigli Gigli Coco Pop. And the friend is played by none other than Al Pacino. And no, I do not know why his hair is like that. I guess when you're Al freaking Pacino, no one's gonna tell you no. But someone should have told him no.
And I can't say I'm surprised to see Pacino in this movie. The man did Jack and Jill. He has no standards. Again, someone should have told him no.
And I'm sure this will come as a surprise to no one, but he is hands down the best part of Gigli. He appears to be the only one that realizes just how ridiculous this movie is, and he is chewing all of the scenery. He chews more scenery than Christopher Walken, and that is saying something. And as soon as he shows up, he sits all three of these bumbling mobsters down, shoots Lewis in the head after a really bizarre line.
You want to go to medical school?
Medical school?
And then proceeds to explain to the other two just how stupid this movie is. Obviously, trying to extort a very federal prosecutor, who has since been upgraded to federal fucking prosecutor, is not going to accomplish anything except pissing off every Fed in the country. And sending the thumb was an even dumber idea because, of course, they checked the thumbprint and realized it wasn't actually Brian's thumb. And if these incompetent jackasses had just left well enough alone, Pacino probably could have gone to court and beaten the charges. All they did was make things infinitely worse.
You don't try to extort a federal fucking prosecutor!
You know, if you have to have a character in your movie explain to the other characters just how stupid the plot is, maybe that's a sign that your script needed a rewrite.
In any case, Ricki and Mr. Jimmy Jam ensure Pacino that they will make sure Brian is never able to testify against him. Considering Brian's mental state, I don't think that will be a problem. So Pacino lets them go, and they immediately take Brian out of town and call the feds so they can pick him up. But not before they stumble upon what looks like a film crew on the beach shooting an episode of Baywatch, or at least something similar.
Yes, that Baywatch thing actually had a payoff.
And continuing the theme of no one in Los Angeles has any fucking security, they just let Brian walk onto the set and participate in some sort of beach party scene where he meets an Australian girl.
Yes, the Australian Weather Service thing also had a payoff. It was stupid, but you know what? They stuck with it till the end, and a part of me respects that.
And Mr. McFeely and Ricki drive off into the sunset and live hetero ever after. The end.
And finally, after all these years, I made it through Gigli. Honestly, I expected worse. Like I said, there was no way it could ever live up to the hype. But it was still pretty bad.
The dialogue is ridiculous, the plot is so nonsensical the movie has to call itself out, the comedy doesn't land, the acting is subpar, the romantic chemistry is non-existent, which is hilarious considering these two were engaged at one point, and the idea of turning a lesbian straight is just, ugh. Critics lambasted this thing, and rightfully so, and the general movie-going public didn't care for it either. Though, to be fair, not many people saw it to begin with. In its opening weekend, it only brought home about $3.7 million, less than Finding Nemo in its 10th week. And as low as that was, its second weekend brought $678,000, which percentage-wise is the 8th worst second weekend drop of all time. All but a handful of theaters dropped it after that. Overall, it made $7.2 million worldwide, considerably less than the $54 million budget. Though, according to an expose by The Wrap, its actual budget was closer to $75 million, as production company Revolution Studios had a tendency to underreport budgets to make their losses look more palatable. Not an uncommon practice in Hollywood, by the way.
And you might be wondering, how the hell could a movie like this cost so much to make? Well, Jennifer Lopez made about $12 million for her part, Ben Affleck made $12.5, throw in Pacino and Walken, who I'm sure don't come cheap even for a cameo, plus what appear to be some relatively expensive LA location shoots, and I could see how the budget for this thing could balloon out of control and turn it into a very expensive flop.
I do kinda get what they were trying to do with Gigli. Larry Gigli Jingleheimer Schmidt is an insecure guy who tries way too hard to be an alpha male and is constantly frustrated when success isn't just handed to him on a silver platter simply because he's an alpha, or thinks he is. But as he starts to let go of his insecurities and stops trying to be someone he's not, he ends up much happier and at peace with himself. There's a lesson to be learned there, but this lesson was likely lost on the few people who saw the movie as Gigli did such a terrible job of teaching it. This travesty ended up taking home 6 Razzies out of 9 nominations. The 2 leads took home Worst Actor, Actress, and Screen Couple. Martin Brest won Worst Screenplay and Director and hasn't made a movie since. And of course it won Worst Picture.
And at the time, I would have thought the Razzies made the right call, even though the movie wasn't as bad as I expected, and it had some stiff competition from its fellow nominees. You had The Cat in the Hat, a dreadful adaptation of the classic Dr. Seuss tale that was wholly inappropriate for children. Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, one of the most poorly directed action movies I've ever seen. Well done, McG. From Justin to Kelly, a piss-poor musical vehicle for a couple of American Idol contestants for reasons that science has yet to explain, and The Real Cancun, which barely qualifies as a movie. A bunch of kids went to Cancun for spring break and they filmed it. That's literally it. They thought people would pay money for this. They were wrong.
But as bad as those movies were, Gigli was still worse, in my opinion. It seems like the logical choice for Worst Picture. However, there is another movie that came out in 2003 that was far worse. One of the all-time legends of bad movies. It's so bad, they made a movie about how bad this movie was.
I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about The Room.
I don't know what I can say about The Room that hasn't already been said. If you've seen it, you know. And if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you've heard many things about this movie, and I assure you, they're all true. It's horrible, and it's hilarious. And how can I possibly pick anything else as the worst movie of 2003? Mama didn't raise no fool. Gigli is bad, but it's not The Room bad. At least Gigli has a relatively coherent story, was lit properly, and had costumes that fit. And J-Lo's performance was bad, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as this.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Mind you, I don't blame the Razzies for not nominating this one. The voters likely didn't even know it existed. Most people didn't at the time. It was only released in 2 theaters in Los Angeles for 2 weeks because, according to his co-star Greg Sestero, who plays the role of Oh Hi Mark, Tommy Wiseau wanted it to be eligible for the Oscars.
And honestly, a part of me respects that. Shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land among the stars. Of course, in Tommy's case, those stars were black holes, but you gotta take what you can get.
Because The Room had such a limited theatrical run, it didn't start to become well known through word of mouth until a few years later, so I'm not surprised the Razzies missed this one. And apart from The Room, Gigli probably was the worst movie of the year, or at least it's up there. So with that caveat, I say the Razzies made the right call. Damn them for nominating Pacino and Walken for Worst Supporting Actor though. They were the only good parts of the movie and absolutely did not deserve that.
But hey, they wouldn't be the Razzies if they didn't show their ass. Next time, we're going to revisit one of the first movies I ever reviewed on this channel. I don't expect it will be any better the second time around. Until then, I am the Smeghead, and Hollywood can suck it.
I like big butts, and I cannot lie. The other brothers can't deny. When the girls walk in with the AB waist